Hello again and welcome to the Tobago House of Assemblies Division of Education, Innovation and Energy's e-learning program. My name is Kimmery Richardson Thomas and I'm your facilitator for CAPE Communication Studies. Today we're going to begin our exploration of Module 2 with specific emphasis on language and community. Our session today, it is hoped that you'll be able to discuss the concept of language, identify the functions of language in Caribbean identity and human societies, and describe the role of history on the language situation and attitudes to language in your respective territories. So we're going to look at what is the difference between a language, and language. So when we look at the terms, we're seeing a language versus language. When we speak about a language, specifically when we talk about it using we begin by saying a specifically, the determiner a language, this is a system of arbitrary symbols and rules that humans use to communicate with each other. Pay attention here. Arbitrary symbols and rules. Simply put, what it means is that the symbols that we use in our language, they're arbitrary in that they do not necessarily indicate what it is we're talking about. For example, when you write the letter A, or if we say specifically the symbols that make up the word cat, these letters or symbols that make up the word cat do not in any way look like an actual cat. This is what we mean when we say they're arbitrary symbols. The symbols that are used within our language do not necessarily look like what we're talking about. The word water does not in any way look like actual water. So these are arbitrary symbols, and then we also have arbitrary rules that constitute this system that refers to a language. These are rules that human beings would have constructed so to be able to dictate how we structure the information that we use for a language. A language is specific to a particular community. And when we say that, we understand that within different communities, you can have English, you can have German, Spanish, Hindi. And these are just examples of types of languages. When we say a language, the language is specific to a community within a group of people. And when we talk about a language, this is what we're referring to. However, or rather on the other hand, when we speak about language, language itself is the broad term. It is the broad term which refers to the use of the thousands of all such systems as a general phenomenon. Exclusively human mode of communication. Language is exclusively human. Now you may say that the parrot can talk, and that the parrot, and in that talking, while the parrot talks, it does not mean that the parrot has language. What the parrot is able to do is mimic sound. But when we really explore what are the functions and characteristics of language, you will be able to understand that the parrot is not really communicating with a language, but rather mimicking sound. So let's explore in some detail. The characteristics of language. When we talk about the characteristics of language, simply put, what language is. These are the things that make a language a language. So a language is dynamic. It's creative. What do we mean by this? When we say that language is dynamic, what we mean is that it changes through time. Language does not remain fixed. And it's one of the things that truly excites me about language. The language that would have been spoken, and if we take, for example, English that was spoken 300, 400 years ago, it's not the same variety of English that's spoken now. Language is a living phenomenon. It is dynamic and it changes over time. Language is creative. Humans produce infinite numbers of sentences, infinite amounts of sentences. Have you ever heard a child say something? They're 3 years old and they make a statement and you wonder, how does he say that? Where did he get that from? Within our human structure, within our human makeup, we are able to come up with different sentences over time. You're going to say some things today that never came out of your mouth before. And even if it may be the same idea, it may be structured differently because of that creative aspect of language. Language is also communicative. It is involved in transferring information. We use language to be able to share information and details with other people, with other groups, with other communities. It's very informative. It has that ability to transfer information. It is also interpersonal. Language is used to build relations and rapport. Even during this period where our schools have been closed, many of you may be interacting with your teachers through the online resources, and you're using Zoom and you're trying to maintain a rapport. You're trying to maintain a rapport and relationships. You're going to find that there are times your teachers are going to indicate mute your mics, but then there are times they'd want to hear you because it is interpersonal. There are times they want to be able to see you because language is interpersonal. You're not able to really connect with people if you're not able to get feedback from them and really hear what they have to say. And this is what makes language so rich and dynamic, because it's interpersonal. Language is also verbal or non-verbal. It involves those paralinguistics and the proxemics and kinesics, which really talk about how we communicate with each other in terms of body language, how close we stand to each other. What are those other elements that are non-verbal that communicate to people? All of us, especially as West Indian people, you know about that facial expression from your mother or your grandmother that tells you you've done something wrong. We know about the eye, and it speaks of those non-verbal things. We know about if you're standing speaking to someone in authority with your hand on your hip, and it communicates something and they tell you, take your hand off your hip, what it communicates. And language is verbal as well as non-verbal, how we communicate these things. Language is community specific. There are signs and codes specific to a particular social group. So you're going to find, especially when we talk about things like slangs, there are certain slangs that are specific to a particular social group and you would associate with that group. Whereas there are other slangs that, or other words, that if you use it in another social group, it may be deemed inappropriate. We will explore a lot of these in another lesson, but we want you to be aware of what are these characteristics of language. We'll take a look at one more. Language is also arbitrary. Any symbol can be mapped to any concept. Any symbol can be mapped to any concept. Even what we have here, these look like squiggly lines. Somebody else can use them to indicate snakes. Somebody can use them to indicate water. But then when we talk about these symbols, it can be mapped to any concept. But what we try to do now is to use the actual words and the symbols that make up our alphabet to indicate exactly what we mean. But understand that there's that arbitrary nature of language that means any symbol can be mapped to any concept. Again, it's what makes language so exciting. Now, let's take a look at the functions of language. This looks at what language does. We looked first at what language is. Now we're going to look at how language actually functions and what are the things that language would do. So the functions of language. There are 6 main functions that we are going to look at today when we talk about how language functions. And these functions include the poetic, expressive, cognitive, informative, phatic, and metalinguistic functions. So we're going to explore this in some more detail. The first one is the poetic function. When we talk about language having a poetic function, we're looking at how it is used in literary, stylistic, or imaginative ways. So we can talk here now about when we use language for songs, when we use language for stories and for poems, when you might write an essay that may have a lot of imagery and description. This is the poetic function of language. The focus is on the structure and on the pattern of the language. So again, if we go back and we think about a poem and we look at how it's structured, poems will have stanzas. So you pay attention to the layout and structure of the language within the poetic function. A song would have verses. Again, the structure. If we have a story, stories may have paragraphs. Stories may also have chapters, depending on the size of the story, if it's a novel. But bear in mind that the poetic function is not restricted to verse. And verse here simply means, when we talk about verse, our verse would be our poems. And verse can also be songs. And what we're saying is that the poetic function is not restricted to poems and songs. As I indicated just now, it can be an essay, it can be a story, it can be a novel, it can be an article in a newspaper, and you're using the poetic function when you're writing. I have come across quite a number of very interesting posts on social media that utilize the poetic function, and they were neither poems nor songs. All right? Moving along. Our second function is the expressive function. Now, this is a bit different from the poetic function, and you'll see why. When we talk about the expressive function, language is used to express one's feelings, ideas, or attitudes without consideration for a reader or a listener. You're writing for yourself. Now, it does not mean that it would not be read by anyone else, but the purpose of writing is to share your own feelings about an issue. You're talking about your own ideas, and we're going to see what are some examples of this. The speaker or the writer is not trying to affect change. You're not trying to affect change in the audience or elicit a response. You are just sharing how you feel. He or she is merely giving vent to emotions or needs. And this is the kind of writing that we can find in diaries or journals. Again, it's reiterating the point that you're not writing with any consideration for a reader or a listener. When someone writes in a diary, when you write in your personal journal, you're not writing for someone to respond to what you've written. And that is what we refer to when we speak about the expressive function of language. Then we have the third one, the cognitive function. The cognitive function here, language is used to affect the audience. Pay attention. You want to affect the audience. You want to evoke a response. You want to stir up something. You want the reader, you want your listener to react to what it is you have written. And that reaction can be varied. It can be anger. It can be joy. It can be regret, remorse. It can be sympathy. But depending on how you structured it and you've written it, if you're looking for a response, you're using the cognitive function of language. So again, you want to persuade, entertain, stir up anger, arouse sympathy. These are cognitive functions. So examples of cognitive types of writing or writing with a cognitive function would include our jokes, political speeches, horror stories. These are just some very, very simple, basic examples. Again, any type of writing that solicits or tries to elicit a response from the reader, cognitive function. Number 4, we have the informative function. Here, language is used with the intention to convey information to others. What we're doing here in this lesson is fulfilling, and the content of this lesson is fulfilling the informative function. I'm not trying to elicit an emotional response from you. I'm trying to ensure that you get information that can be applicable to what it is you're preparing to do. So it's the informative function. I want to convey information. We're talking here to convey information. Right? So some other examples, we talk here about our news broadcasts. We talk about notice boards at your school. And most of your textbooks are examples of the informative function of language. Then we have the Phatic function, and I want you to pay attention to the word, because it's another word that you may see very often. So you need to understand what it means, because you may come across it again. It may show up in your exam, but understand the word and what it refers to. With the Phatic function of language, language is used simply to establish or maintain contact. And this is most obvious in spoken communication. It does not seek to generate, and note here, it does not seek to generate a meaningful response. What do we mean by that Phatic function? You're walking down the road, you pass someone, and out of courtesy, good morning. You're not expecting to stop to have a big conversation with them. It's not an analysis of if the morning is good. So that when you tell someone good morning, you're not expecting them to ask, explain to me in as clearly a manner as possible what is good about the morning. That's not what you're looking for. It is not expecting a meaningful response. You say to someone, hey, how are you doing? When you ask, how are you doing, you're not necessarily expecting them to go into a very long analysis and lecture about how they are doing physically, emotionally, and mentally. That is the function of language. It's just elicits a very, and when we say it doesn't expect a meaningful response, you can respond to something. When we speak about the Phatic function, you can respond. Someone says good morning, your response should be good morning. Someone says hey, you can respond by simply saying hey, what's up? If you're asked what's up, someone can simply respond, I good, everything cool, everything. And one of the things I realize a lot of young people would say is I normal. It's not really expecting a more meaningful response, but a response is still expected to some degree. And lastly, we want to talk about the metalinguistic function. This function, language is used to comment on or refer to. It's used to comment on. It's used to refer to or discuss language. This is where we're using language to discuss language. That is the metalinguistic function. Here we're looking at a critique of an essay or a speech. This is a very critical type of function. And when we say critical, I think too often within our own context, within our society, when we hear criticism or critical, we always see it in a negative light. But a critique, or when you are criticizing something, it is not always negative. The word critique really asks for a breakdown of this information. What are the respective parts and how are they structured? You're looking at an analysis. So you're analyzing language. This is the metalinguistic function. And I want you to know, when you look at the analysis for your CAPE Communication Studies, your portfolio, that analysis that you have to do for your internal assessment fulfills the metalinguistic function of language. You are analyzing your reflective piece, looking at those areas of communicative behavior, register, attitudes to language, and the last one is slipping me right now. But those 4 areas, you're doing that analysis for your CAPE Communication Studies internal assessment. So as we move on, we want to look specifically at the Caribbean language experience. The Caribbean is a unique environment when we begin to speak about language and what is in that whole melting pot that has become our Caribbean region. There are three words that I want us to look at as we get into this discussion, and it will continue in our next lesson, but we want to get an introductory look at the Caribbean language experience. And in order to do that, we need to be familiar with the term lingua franca, pidgin, pronounced pigeon. The D is silent, sorry, right, the D is silent. And then we have Creole. So lingua franca, pidgin, and Creole. What is a lingua franca? A lingua franca is generally a third language that is distinct from the native language of both parties involved in communication. So it's a third language. It's distinct from the native language, and when we say native language here, native language is the language that you grew up speaking. Whatever you grew up speaking, whatever that language is, that is your native language. If you are learning another language as you've gotten older, that is your second language. Another term that we use for native language is first language. Your first language. That's the language that you learned within the environment that you grew up in. So the lingua franca is a third language that is very distinctive from your native language. And if you have two people involved in communication, if they both speak two different native languages, the lingua franca will be whatever they've become, whatever they've decided to use to communicate. That's sort of a middle ground. This is why it's called a third language. Sometimes as the language becomes more widespread, the native populations of an area will speak the language, the lingua franca, to each other as well. And this here is something that has happened historically. So where the language becomes more widespread, you're going to find in situations like that, where that lingua franca becomes widespread, people who may have been speaking language A. So if we have here two parties speaking language A, communicating with language B, so they are communicating with each other, but they don't speak each other's language, you're going to have a lingua franca developing that becomes language C. But what you can have in situations where language C becomes widespread, the native populations will begin to speak that lingua franca, language C, to each other. And this is how languages evolve and why languages change. As people continue to interact with speakers of other languages, new languages can emerge. I find that so exciting. Now, the other thing we need to know about lingua francas is that it can also refer to languages which are native to one another. And remember to take a picture as we go through. Take a picture as we discuss so that you can refer to what it is we looked at today. So the lingua franca can refer to languages which are native to one nation, often a colonial power. And this is important for our context when we talk about the Caribbean experience. The lingua franca can refer to languages which are native to one nation, and often that can be a colonial power, but it's used as a second language for communication between diverse language communities in a colony or former colonies. For example, within our country, Trinidad and Tobago, the main colonial power, and we had different colonial powers. We've had ownership by the French, we've had ownership by the Spanish, by the British. In Tobago specifically, there's been ownership for a particular period by the Dutch. And all of these European powers, these colonial powers, brought with them their language. So it would have also meant that there would have been times within the history, and if I take Tobago specifically, times when you would have had Spanish being spoken, French being spoken, Dutch being spoken, and English, which has remained as a remnant as our national or official language. But where the colonial power, where their language has become dominant, it becomes the second language for communication. So where we've had diverse language communities, if we go back to our history, and we need to understand our history when we talk about communication studies and language and society. When we look at our history tells us that Africans would have been brought to the Caribbean, and African slaves came to the Caribbean speaking different languages. There were different African languages within the continent. So when slaves came, all those slaves did not speak the same variety. So what happened is, even when they came with diverse languages, the lingua franca became their second language. And that lingua franca would have been the language of the colonial power. Today, the lingua franca plays an important role in global communication as well. The United Nations website defines its official languages as Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. There are 6 official languages in the United Nations. So we have 6 official languages. But I want us to understand something here. While there are 6 official languages, English is the current lingua franca of international business, education, science, technology, diplomacy, entertainment, radio, seafaring, and aviation. English is the current lingua franca for all of these. So that there's an understanding that regardless of the language that you may speak within your own territory, within your own country, your own region, when we speak about international relations, international business, international education, anything on an international scale that falls under any of these headings, seafaring, aviation, diplomacy, from an international point of view, English is the new lingua franca.